Pull up a chair for a moment. A well-kept home was once held together by dozens of small skills. A way to let a bed breathe, a way to coax a shine from a floor, a way to save a shirt that had plenty of life left in it. These were not magic tricks, and they were not the same in every household. They were practical habits, passed from hand to hand, until convenience made many of them easy to forget. The old housewife's work was not only about making things look nice, it was about giving time, labor, and materials a second thought. A careful hand noticed the draft under a door, the loose thread at a cuff, the apple that needed using before it softened. By the end, tell us which of these your family still practiced, or which one you wish somebody had taught you. The useful test was simple. After the work, the next person could find the broom, cloth, or spool without asking where it had gone. The first skill was not a product. It was a habit of giving things a home. Brooms rested near the work they served, linens stayed together, and everyday tools did not wander from room to room. Beecher's household thinking treated order as working knowledge, when the hand knows where to reach. A small job does not become a search through every cupboard. The reward is quiet. The house feels easier to use because every object is ready for its next turn. A plain ingredient was chosen for a known surface, used sparingly, rinsed, and allowed to dry before the next treatment. Before a shelf full of brightly labeled bottles, a household could keep a few plain helpers close at hand. Vinegar could cut through a sharp smell, soda could help lift grime, and salt could lend a little abrasion where a surface allowed it. The point was not to mix everything together or promise that one remedy suited every material. It was to know the surface, use a small amount, rinse carefully, and let ordinary things do useful work. The room changed by degrees, cool air at the window, a lighter quilt in the morning, and a bed that no longer felt closed up. In the morning, the bed was not always made the instant a person rose. Covers could be pulled back, a window opened when the weather allowed, and the bedding given time to release the night's warmth and dampness. This was simple household care, not a medical promise. Fresh air and sunlight changed the feeling of a room, and a bed that had been aired was more pleasant to return to at night. The blacking was spread on cool iron and rubbed smooth, with the stove left alone until the coating was dry and the room clear. The stove was a working surface as much as an appliance. After it had cooled, a household could clean away ash and apply a suitable stove blacking to the iron, then rub it to an even, quiet sheen. The work needed patience and ventilation, and the product belonged on a cool stove, not a hot one. Done properly, blacking made the kitchen's hardest used metal look cared for instead of merely worn. Polishing followed the grain instead of fighting it, and the thin coat was buffed until the boards looked warm rather than wet. A wood floor could be cleaned first, allowed to dry, and then treated with a thin coat of wax before polishing. The secret was restraint. Too much wax made work for the next person and could leave a slippery surface. A thin layer, spread evenly and buffed with a cloth, gave the boards a soft glow. The motion itself became familiar. Sweep, wipe, dry, wax and rub until the grain came through. The folded cloth gave the cleaner a fresh face for each ledge, while the falling dust waited for the broom at the very end. Dusting had an order because dust falls. A careful cleaner began with higher shelves, ledges and frames, then worked down toward tables and the floor. The cloth was folded to present a clean side, and delicate objects were steadied rather than hurried over. This was not a contest to make one pass look dramatic. It was a way to keep yesterday's dust from landing on today's work. The rhythm had a practical order: loosen, scrub, rinse, wring, and hang, giving each fabric only as much force as it could bear. Laundry day began with sorting, soaking when needed, and treating the dirtiest parts before the whole load went into the tub. A washboard gave the hands a ribbed surface against which cloth could be worked, while a wringer pressed out water before the garment went to the line. The work was physical, so the order mattered. Light pieces could be saved for later, and a shirt was handled by its seams instead of twisted until it lost its shape. The bluing water needed to look almost too pale to matter. A dark streak meant the finishing step had been rushed. White cloth can take on a tired yellow cast, and a tiny amount of bluing was once used to make the eye read the fabric as cooler and brighter. The liquid was diluted according to its directions and distributed through the rinse rather than poured in a dark spot. It was a finishing touch, not a substitute for washing. The old lesson was to use a little, keep it even, and never mistake color for cleanliness. A collar was turned smooth before the iron arrived, because starch could hold a wrinkle just as firmly as it held a clean edge. Starch gave certain cotton pieces a firmer hand, especially collars, cuffs, and aprons that needed to hold their shape. Fabric was dampened, the starch applied lightly, and the piece smoothed before ironing. Too much made cloth stiff and prone to flaking. Too little did not hold. The satisfying part was the change under the iron. A rumpled edge became a clean line that could survive a day's work. Clothespins belonged on strong seams, and a shake before hanging kept folds from drying into hard ridges. The clothesline was more than a place to hang wet fabric. Garments were shaken out, fastened so they would not stretch, and spaced for air to move between them. Heavy pieces needed support at strong seams, while delicate items were kept out of harsh light when necessary. Wind did much of the work. A line full of clean laundry was a household signal that water, soap, and effort had been turned into something fresh. The iron moved from the small shaped parts to the broad panels, so the finished garment was not crushed by reaching across it again. Ironing worked best when the cloth was slightly damp and the sequence was planned. A collar, cuff, or seam was opened first, then the broad panels were smoothed with steady strokes. The iron had to be tested on a safe edge and its heat respected. An iron that was too hot could mark fabric before a hand had time to react. Folded linen, cotton, and a good pressing cloth made the work calmer and more exact. The safest first move was often to lift a mark away, not grind it in, and to test any treatment where nobody would see it. The old stain remover was often time. A mark was noticed before it had settled, the fabric was identified, and a small treatment was tried on an unseen area. Grease, fruit, ink, and rust did not all answer to the same method, so a careful hand did not reach for the strongest thing first. Blotting was safer than grinding a stain deeper. The goal was to rescue the garment without creating a larger scar. The rounded support kept the worn place open to the needle, making it possible to build strength without pulling the sock out of shape. Darning filled a thinning place with thread before it opened into a hole. The sock was stretched over a small egg-shaped form or another rounded support, and fine stitches were laid across the weak area, then woven through them in the other direction. It was not invisible perfection. It was a soft patch of strength placed where the foot needed it, a few minutes of patience in exchange for more wear. A work patch was sewn for movement, with enough give at the edge to survive the next bend, kneel, or reach. A patch worked best when it respected the garment's job. The fabric was trimmed cleanly, the patch cut with enough allowance to hold, and the edges turned or secured before the stitches were tightened. Work clothes could show their repairs. A neat patch was evidence that useful cloth had not been thrown away at the first tear. The hand learned to match the weight of the patch to the weight of the garment. The old collar was opened slowly because its shape was the pattern the fresh side had to follow when it was turned. Collars and cuffs often wore out before the body of a shirt did. Turning them meant carefully removing the worn edge, reversing or reshaping the piece, and sewing it back so the fresher side faced out. The work demanded a sharp eye because the collar had to sit evenly when finished. It was a small form of renewal. The shirt still belonged to the family, but its most visible edges received another life. Buttons, linings, and sound seams were counted as carefully as the cloth, since each could serve the next garment. Making over meant looking at an old dress, coat, or shirt for its remaining good parts. A bodice might become a child's garment. Sound panels might become an apron, lining, or household cloth. Seams were opened with care, and the new pattern was planned around the fabric that remained. The skill was less about fashion than judgment. A worn thing could still contain strong cloth, good buttons, and a useful shape. Marking a hem while the garment was worn prevented a small alteration from becoming an awkward cut made by guesswork. Basic sewing kept a household from treating every poor fit as a lost garment. A hem could be lifted, a waistband adjusted, a seam reinforced, or a button moved to make room. The work started with trying the garment on and marking the change, not with cutting in a hurry. Needle, thread, scissors, and a little time could make a purchased or handed-down piece sit comfortably enough for another season. The maker checked tension often, because a warm piece that curled, tightened, or stretched in the wrong place needed correction early. Yarn became useful when the hands understood tension, shape, and repair. A knitted cuff, a crocheted edge, or a small warm piece could be made from a new skein or from yarn carefully unraveled from an old item. The work carried its own rhythm: loop, pull, check, repeat. It was not only decoration, it made warmth portable and gave a quiet occupation to the hours when conversation and handwork shared the same room. The jar was only the final container. The real craft was clean preparation, correct heat, and a seal that was checked before storage. Canning asked for cleanliness, sound produce, proper heat, and a method suited to the food. Jars and equipment were prepared. Produce was handled promptly, and the sealed jars were checked before they went onto the shelf. The USDA's home canning guidance belongs here because safe preservation depends on process, not folklore. A bright row of jars was beautiful, but the real accomplishment was keeping the food sound from garden season into the months when the garden was quiet. Fruit changed under the spoon from bright pieces to a thickened mixture, and the cook learned to trust texture rather than chase a color. Jam and jelly began with fruit at the right stage, careful cooking and attention to the balance between juice, sugar, and setting. Foam was managed, hot product was transferred to prepared containers, and the finished jars were left to cool before storage. The craft was in knowing when to stop. Cook too little and the set stayed loose. Cook too long and the fruit lost its brightness. A spoonful on toast carried the memory of summer forward. Even slices dried more evenly, and cooling the finished food before packing kept warmth from turning into trapped moisture. Drying concentrated food by removing moisture. Slices were prepared evenly, spread so air could move around them, and dried until they were leathery or crisp according to the food. Once cool, they needed protection from dampness and insects. The method suited a household that had more produce than it could eat at once. A handful of dried fruit in a winter cupboard was a small, chewy reminder that the garden had been planned for more than one season. The brine or salt had a job to do, so the vessel was kept clean and the proportions followed, instead of being improvised by feel. Salt and acid helped preserve foods when used with a tested method and clean equipment. Vegetables were prepared, packed, and covered as the recipe or household practice required, then given time to develop their flavor. The important habit was not to guess at safety. It was to keep the process clean, respect the proportions, and label the jar by what it contained. A pantry organized this way made its own kind of calendar. The best shelf was the one that could be inspected, cool, dark, airy enough for the crop, and never forgotten after the door closed. A root-cellar worked by giving hardy vegetables a cool, dark, steady place to wait. Potatoes, carrots, turnips, and similar crops were cleaned of excess soil without being damaged, kept from freezing, and checked from time to time. One spoiled piece could affect its neighbors, so inspection was part of storage. The cellar was not merely a dark room. It was a way of carrying the harvest through the months when the fields offered little. The churn announced the change before the eyes did, as liquid gave way to heavier movement and the butter gathered against the dasher. Butter began as cream and became something solid through repeated motion. The cream was brought to a suitable temperature, the churn worked until the butter gathered, and the buttermilk was drained away. The butter was then washed and pressed so remaining liquid was reduced. The sound changed as the churn turned, slosh, thicken, gather. What looked like a plain kitchen task was really a lesson in watching texture and stopping at the right moment. Storage was paired with rotation. The older eggs were chosen first, and every shell was treated as food that deserved attention. Eggs were valuable because they arrived a few at a time and could carry a household through a lean stretch. Preservation meant selecting sound eggs, keeping them clean and protected, and using the period method appropriate to the household's storage conditions. This is not a place for a casual modern recipe or a blanket promise. The old skill was attention: know when an egg was gathered, store it carefully, and use older ones in cooked dishes first. A leftover became something new through judgment about safety, moisture, and heat, not through the wish to make yesterday disappear. Leftovers became a new meal when the cook changed their form rather than simply reheating the same plate. A little meat could meet gravy, vegetables could become a filling, and stale bread could take on a useful role. The point was to judge what remained safe and wholesome, then add heat, moisture, or seasoning as needed. A household that reworked food was not pretending scraps were something else. It was respecting the work already spent growing, buying, and cooking them. The dough told its own story in the hand, becoming smoother and more elastic before the loaf entered the heat of the oven. Homebread asked for flour, liquid, a leavening method, time, and a hand that could feel when dough had changed. The mixture was brought together, kneaded or worked as the method required, allowed to rise when appropriate, and baked until the loaf sounded and looked ready. The recipe mattered, but so did the senses, the smell of yeast, the give of the dough, the browned crust. A loaf made the kitchen feel occupied before anyone took a bite. Because the ingredients could irritate skin and eyes, protective habits were part of the knowledge, not an afterthought added later. Soap making was a serious household process, not a casual experiment. Fats or oils were combined with an alkaline ingredient in the right proportions, with protection for the skin and eyes and careful control of heat. The mixture was allowed to finish before use. Because the materials could burn or irritate, period knowledge included caution and patience. The finished bar represented the practical urge to turn what a household had into something that cleaned well. Each dip added a thin skin of light, and the wick had to stay centered while the wax cooled around it. Candles could be made by dipping a wick again and again into warmed wax or tallow, letting each coat cool before the next one. Keeping the wick centered gave the candle a steadier burn, while a level surface helped each layer build evenly. It was slow work, but it transformed stored fat or wax into light. The hands had to keep a rhythm, dip, lift, cool, and dip again. Slow heat clarified the fat, while straining and dry storage kept the useful result separate from the solids and moisture. Rendering separated usable fat from connective tissue through gentle heat and careful straining. Small pieces were heated slowly, the clear fat collected, and the solids removed before the lard cooled and was stored. Clean tools and a cool container mattered because unwanted moisture shortened its life. The skill was a form of household economy. A part of the animal that might be discarded became a cooking fat or a useful ingredient. The cleaner was matched to its surface and marked clearly, because an economical household still needed to know what was in a bottle. A household cleaner could be made from simple materials, but simple did not mean universally safe. The person mixing it knew the surface it was meant for, measured rather than guessed, and kept the container clearly identified. Strong combinations were avoided, and the cleaner was stored away from food and children. The useful lesson was control. A modest cleaner, used on the right material, was better than an impressive mixture that damaged the thing it touched. Comfort measures belonged beside judgment. Warmth and rest for minor trouble, and a clear decision to seek medical help when the room could not solve it. Older households often kept familiar comfort measures close: warm drinks, cloths, rest, fresh air, and simple preparations for minor discomfort. These belonged to ordinary care, not a promise to treat serious illness. A careful family knew when home comfort was enough and when a doctor was needed. The skill worth remembering is the attention behind the remedy. Noticing a person's condition, keeping the room calm, and not confusing tradition with professional medical care. The ledger became useful when it was opened regularly, turning scattered receipts and remembered promises into a visible household picture. A household ledger made invisible work visible. Income, regular expenses, purchases, and amounts due could be written down so memory did not have to carry the whole burden. The value was not in a fancy book. It was in returning to the page often enough to see where materials and money were going. Beecher's emphasis on order and apportioning resources fits this quiet practice. A household could make decisions from what it knew, not from a feeling that everything was disappearing. Apportioning did not make resources larger. It made the order of need visible before a small want quietly consumed them. Budgeting began by separating what had to be paid from what could wait. Food, fuel, clothing, shelter, and household needs each claimed a place, and the plan was adjusted when circumstances changed. This is not a promise that a neat budget solves hardship. It is a way of giving limited resources a deliberate order. The old ledger helped a family ask a plain question before spending. What work must this money do first? A purchase was weighed against the pantry, the season, the material, and the work required if the cheaper thing failed. The careful buyer knew that the lowest price was not always the lowest cost. Weight, quality, season, durability, and the amount already in the pantry all mattered. A list kept a purchase from becoming an impulse. While comparison helped a household avoid paying for something it could make or mend, this was practical attention rather than a secret formula. The best bargain was often the thing that served its purpose fully and did not need replacing soon. The phrase did not demand hoarding. It asked whether repair, reuse, or a smaller substitute could honor the material already on hand. Use it up, wear it out, make it do or do without. The old saying gave thrift a shape. It did not mean keeping every broken object forever. It meant asking whether a thing could be repaired, repurposed, or used completely before another was brought home. A jar might hold something else. A worn towel might become a rag, and a coat might yield good buttons. The habit was respect for material and for the labor inside it. Fresh water, clean cloth, and a quiet room were acts of care, while changes in condition belonged to the doctor's attention. A simple sickroom was organized around rest, cleanliness, quiet, and observation. Fresh water, clean linens, a reachable basin, and a warm but aired room made care more manageable. The person tending the room watched for changes and called for medical help when the illness exceeded household care. There was no glamour in it. The skill was steadiness. Keep the patient comfortable, keep the space clean, and let kindness become a practical routine. The garden was planned for the kitchen, with crops gathered at useful stages and surplus carried forward through the pantry. A kitchen garden was planned around what the household actually used. Herbs, greens, roots, and other crops were planted in succession when possible, watered and weeded, then gathered at the right stage. The garden fed the kitchen in the present and the pantry later through drying, pickling, or canning. Its lesson was continuity. A few beds, watched regularly, could turn attention into meals and make the household less dependent on a single season. Welcome was made from preparation rather than display. A swept chair, a clear cup, and a room where a tired visitor could settle. Hospitality was not the same as expensive decoration. A warm room, a clear place to sit, a clean cloth, and something simple to offer could tell a guest they had been expected. The work was in noticing. A draught, a tired chair, a cup that needed filling, a child who needed room to move. A welcoming home did not have to be grand. It had to make another person feel safe enough to settle. A child learned the reason behind the task by carrying a safe part of it, then returning the tool so the work could continue tomorrow. Children learned homemaking by doing a real piece of it. A child could fold a cloth, sort buttons, carry a light basket, weed a row, or put away the tools used for a task. The lesson was matched to age and ability, and safety came before speed. Work became less mysterious when a grown-up explained why it mattered. In that way, a skill traveled forward, not as a lecture, but as a hand being shown where to begin. These 40 practices were never one universal rulebook. They were a collection of ways people cared for materials, food, rooms, bodies, budgets, and one another. Some belong in a modern home only after safer current guidance is checked. Others are simply beautiful reminders of attention. If your grandmother had a version of one of them, tell us what she did differently. And if this kind of household wisdom is worth keeping, subscribe so these stories aren't lost. These 40 practices were never one universal rulebook. They were a collection of ways people cared for materials, food, rooms, bodies, budgets, and one another. Some belong in a modern home only after safer current guidance is checked. Others are simply beautiful reminders of attention. If your grandmother had a version of one of them, tell us what she did differently. And if this kind of household wisdom is worth keeping, subscribe so these stories aren't